Welcome to this video where we'll start with our first application in Rails 8. Now, the reason why I'm making this series of videos is so that you can learn Ruby on Rails in the latest version. Now, this isn't for people that already know Rails really well but want to learn what's new in Rails 8. This is for people that are brand new to what Rails and they want a tutorial that teaches them the way to do stuff today instead of 5 years ago where there's a lot of different changes. Just a few things about Ruby on Rails. First of all, Rails is an opinionated framework. That means that you can't just put your files wherever you want. They have an opinion on how you should organize your files, on what libraries you should use, and everything else. Now, they do admit that that their opinion isn't always right. So there are options to change stuff. But if you just want an out-of-the-box solution that works, that's what Ruby on Rails tries to be. Another thing with Ruby on Rails is convention over configuration. This is part of it being opinionated. Instead of having a bunch of configuration settings that you have to change to make things work the way you want, you just follow the convention. And if you follow a convention, everything works. And then if you want to change something, then you can add in configuration later. But by default, things should just work. You shouldn't have to do any configuration. Ruby on Rails is also a model view controller framework. That means all of the stuff that deals with the data should go in model files. And then the view is all of our HTML, everything that we see. And the controller is kind of the person in charge. If the user clicks on the link, the controller is in charge of responding to that request. And there's more about the model view controller framework we can talk about, but you will see it as we start developing. And finally, the best thing about frameworks, and this is all frameworks, but especially Ruby on Rails, is the dry principle. Don't repeat yourself. And you'll see that Ruby on Rails will do a lot of stuff for you, so you don't have to be writing SQL statements that can automatically be generated or a lot of HTML. You can focus on your project instead of a lot of other stuff just to make the web application work. So that's some of the great things about Ruby on Rails, but we'll go ahead and get started. So in the previous video, I showed you how to create your application, and now we're going to start adding code into our application. And just a little orientation, we have this app folder right here. In our app folder, we have a models, a views, and a controllers folder where our different code will go for each web page we create. Also, another important file will be in this config folder, and it's called the routes.rb file. Now, you might want to install some extensions if you open up the application.html.erb, and ERB stands for Embedded Ruby. If you don't see any syntax highlighting, there are some extensions you can search on that, and that'll help you highlight your syntax a little better. Now, one thing that we're going to do is we want to start up our server. So we can start our server with bin rails s, and that will start our server. You can see that we can open this in our browser if we want to. But there's a better way to start our server, and that's using Foreman. So Foreman is going to use this procfile.dev. And you might want to edit it if you're using a dev container. You might want to add this -b here. That just binds it to the container so that it can get served on your local machine. So if you're not able to visit your application on your local machine, you can add this and that will probably make things work. Because we have the proc file, we also have this here that's going to compile our CSS. Since we're using Sass, it'll compile our CSS whenever we make changes, and we want to run both of those at the same time. So all we have to do is go bin/dev right here. And by the way, the bin, if you're curious, that bin folder is right here. You don't really want to edit these files, but these are all the things that we can run on our command line. Mostly we'll just run this rels command, but the dev command automatically uses Foreman to start our server and to start our CSS compiler. So whenever we make changes to our CSS, it'll get changed. Now, if you're using OrbStack on a Mac, I just wanted to show you a quick nice feature. And you view your containers that are running, you see this little link here, and if you click it, that'll open it up in your browser. And if you notice, you also have a local domain name that it routes to it instead of localhost :3000 like the others. So if you want to set that up, you will need to include this in your procfile.dev to make it work. And then in your compose.yaml file, that's here in the dev container folder, you have this compose.yaml file here. You can just add in this code right here, add a label, and you're telling OrbStack what domain you want to use. And you do have to use a .local domain to make things work. And then when you save this file, you got to rebuild your container. And then you should be able to have your own local domains if that's something you want to do. Of course, that's not required. And if you don't have OrbStack, if you're working on a Windows machine, then you wouldn't want to do this. Now, for most of the changes you make in your Rails application, they'll get auto picked up and you won't have to restart the server. So when you need a new terminal window, you can just split your terminal, or of course, you can create a new one here in Visual Studio Code. I'll just kind of leave my server running over here. And then we're going to create our first model or our first entity in our database. And we're going to use the scaffold. And this is going to do a lot of code for us. This would probably be 2 to 3 hours worth of work in PHP, if not more. But in Ruby on Rails, we'll just do one line of code on the terminal and it will generate a lot of stuff for us. Now, since it's generating a lot of stuff for us, we really want to make sure we get things right before we run this command. So um, we'll use the bin rails command, and G stands for generate. So we could type out generate fully, and then we'll use the scaffold. So we're going to name our model, and I'm doing a to-do application, so I have tasks that I want to accomplish. So my model name is going to be tasks or a task. Now you want to make sure that you change that for your model that you're going to do in your project. And my task will have a title, which I'll call, it will be, the data type will be a string, and then I'll have a due date, which will be a date time, and then finally a priority, which will be an integer. Now, there are other data types that you can use, and if you want to, the default is a string, and that's going to be kind of a varchar in the database. So if you leave it no data type on there, then it's going to be a string. But if you wanted a multi-line text box, like a comment or something like that, you can do text. And there are other data types, just look it up. They're like, obviously you have doubles or floats. So when we run this, it's going to generate a lot of code for us. So before you press enter, make sure you got your field name spelled right. Make sure you got your model name. Make sure it's a singular model, not tasks, but just task. Those are things you want to check. And you can press enter and run that command. And you can see that it created a lot of code for us. Now you can see that Ruby on Rails or our Visual Studio Code is helping us saying we want to run our migrations. You can probably click that button and it will run it, but I'll show you how to run the migrations on the command line. Now let's see some of this code that got created. Now, the first file we'll look at is in this migrate folder right here. And we'll open this up and we see that we have this create tasks.rb file that got generated. Now this is called a migration. When you're working on PHP, you guys had to create the database tables yourself. But now with Ruby on Rails, instead of creating the database tables manually, we're going to write code to create the database tables. And what this does is it allows you to work in teams because you have your database on your computer that you're using, and then the other members on your team might have their own database on their computers. And you want to separate the databases. That way you can work in isolation. You don't have to worry about you're adding records into the database and somebody else is deleting them and you're getting confused because you're conflicting. So you've kind of isolated your environment. Also, when we go to deploy our application and launch it live on the web, we can use the same migrations. It'll create the same database tables for us. So that's why we have code that generates our database table. And that's what a migration is. You could click this run button up here too. I believe this is because I've installed some of the Ruby on Rails extensions into Visual Studio Code. But to run it, we just go bin rails db migrate. And that will run the migration. If you notice, we now have a schema file that kind of shows us the current schema of our database table. You don't want to edit this as auto-generated, but you can look at it. Now, a couple of things with migrations. let's say that I ran the migration and then I go back here and I edit like a type or I add a field or something like that. Of course, that's not going to modify my database because this code is not going to run again unless I rerun the migration. So if I do want to rerun a migration, I can go bin rels db rollback. And that will undo the last migration, but only the last one. And if we go bin rels db migrate, that will run all of the migrations that haven't been run, all the pending migrations. So if we're joining a new team and we check out the code, we can just migrate our database. It'll run all of these migrations. We'll get the same database that everybody else has. Now, it's really important that you don't delete these migration files. You could possibly delete it on a certain circumstance, but if you migrate your database and then you delete the migration, you can't roll it back because the code's gone. So you want to keep that file around. So if you do want to change it, you can roll back, you can edit your migration, and you can run it again. Now that's if you haven't checked your code into GitHub. Of course, you're working on your project by yourself. You're not in a team, so you actually don't have to worry about this. But if you check your code into GitHub, then your team members are going to run these migrations, and there's nothing going to tell them that a migration has changed and they have to roll back and rerun it. So usually you create a new migration that modifies your database. So usually instead of editing migrations, you create a new migration to change your database. Next, I'll show you this code right here, and it modified when you ran the scaffold command, it added this line of code to your config routes.rb file. Now, this is the router. When a new request comes into the server, the router is in charge of finding the right controller and action to call to respond to this request. Now, this one line of code routes all the things that deal with tasks to the task controller. Now, the other files that were generated is we generated a task controller right here, so that the routes file routes requests coming in, and depending on the request, it will call one of these methods. And you can see here, if we do a get request on our tasks path, then we'll call the index method right here. We also have a helper, a tasks helper. We won't do anything with that in this video. We also have our task model, which doesn't have a lot of code, but it does inherit from application record a lot of functionality. So we have that. And finally, right, in our views folder, we have all of these views right here. This is the index view, a new view, an edit view, and then a show view for those different actions. And these, when they start with an underscore, they're called partials. So they're just a little bit of HTML that we can use and stick into different places. So we have a partial here that generates a form to create a new task and edit a task, and then a partial to display a task here. So let's see what all this code does. Now, whatever URL you have or your domain up here, all you have to do, if it's localhost colon 3000, right after the 3000, you'd add a slash, or if you have your custom domain, you can add that. And we can just add tasks to that. And then we get this right here, and we can add a new task. And this will be complete scaffold video, and we can add a due date on here and a time, and we can add a priority, maybe priority 5, and we can create the task. And now we're back on the index action. We can see all of our tasks. All right, this is the show action, so we can edit this and just edit, and it'll edit the title there. And we can see all of our tasks. We can create a new task, delete me, give it a due date and priority 1, create the task, and then we can destroy this task as well. And now the task is out of the database. So we got all that functionality. And if you remember back in PHP, how much code you had to generate to make this happen, we're able to get this with one line of code. So let's walk through one entire request to see how Ruby on Rails would respond to the request and generate the HTML for that page. So the request will come in, and let's say that it's a get request to the tasks path. So this resources right here says we should look for a task controller and call the index action or the index method on that controller. So that's what the router does. So it finds the task controller and it calls this method right here. Now, this method will first call tasks.all, so it will write a SQL statement, and we can actually see our SQL statements in our logs from our server as they run. Now, we didn't have to write that SQL statement, and in fact, the task model is completely empty. That was all functionality that it inherited from this application record. So then we save that task right here as an instance variable. So this is, of course, a task controller is a class, and an instance variable is a field on the class. So when we instantiate an object, then we can save data under the task field name. So that just keeps the data around so that we can use the data in our views. If you don't put an @ sign in front of here, then that means that at the end of the method, that data disappears. Because we put an @ sign, we'll keep it around for the rest of the request. Now, the next thing that this controller does, or this method does, and we don't see it, is it's going to choose a view to draw up or to generate the HTML. So what view do we choose? By default, and this is Ruby on Rails convention over configuration, by default, it's going to choose the view with the same name as the method. So down here, we have the index.html.erb view. So this is a view that it's going to use. Now, you might notice that it's missing the doc type, it's missing the opening HTML tag and all that other stuff. That's because before this view gets generated, we're going to use in our layouts file, the application layout file here. And remember, the yield is where the index view gets placed. So we can edit this file. It would change every page in our website, but then this content right here gets stuffed right where this yield call goes. And you can see that we have a paragraph, any notice that we want to print out. We print out maybe a title right here, and then I have an H1 tag. And then we have, for each task, we're going to render that task. A render means to draw out or create the HTML for that task. We're also going to have a link to be able to see that task right there, and then a link to create a new task. So let's focus on the render right here. Now, one important thing is this equal sign. If you notice, this line of code has an equal sign. This is just like PHP, where we go into Ruby mode. That's what ERB stands for, embedded Ruby. And then same here, we're in Ruby mode where we can write Ruby code, but how come there's no equal sign here, but there is an equal sign here? Well, that's because this line of code, it's the start of a for loop or a loop, and it's not printing out anything. We're not printing out any HTML into our content. However, this render is creating HTML that we want to print out. So if we don't put this equal sign, it'll create a bunch of HTML, but it won't print it out and we won't see it. So that's, as you move on in this class, that's a little trick on debugging. You might not see some stuff and you could have just forgot that equal sign. The equal sign is just a print statement. Right there. So how does this render work? Well, it looks at what it's passed and it says this is called introspection, and it's really good in object-oriented programming. Render is going to ask task, what kind of class are you? And it's going to say, I'm a task model right here. And then the introspection says, oh, you're a task model. So let's look in our views folder for the tasks folder. And inside of there, let's look for a partial that's called task. So we'll see this partial and it will use this partial. The task will get passed into the partial so that we can print out the title, the due date, and the priority. So all of this code runs and it gets stuffed right here or placed right here in our HTML. And then all of this code gets placed right here in our layout file. And that's how we see our page. Now we can see here's our application layout file right here. And right here, it's just printing out some debug information. I believe in production, this won't be there, but now we could see this is where our partial begins or where our index view begins. And right here is where it ends. So this right here is what got stuffed into that yield call. There is something that we can do. Let's go back and create a new task. And what if I don't include a title? So I'll include a due date. This will be no title, pretty important task, but I don't know what it is because I create it and it has no title. What if we want to make sure there is a title before this task is saved in the database? And we're going to accomplish that through validations. Validations is verifying that our data is valid before it gets saved in the database. So since validations deal with our data, which is our model in the model view controller, that means we're going to add our validations to the model itself, which is this task.rb. So all we need to do is add a validates call, and we'll do a title and presence equals true. That's all we need to do, and let's see what that did. Now we can refresh, but this title is still blank. There's nothing we can do with data that's already saved in the database. But if we try to edit this and we try to update it without a title, it says, hey, the title can't be blank. So now we have to do this important task and we have to have a title there. And now it works. Now, even when we try to create a new task with a blank title, it says it can't be saved with a blank title. Now we can add a validation on due date and priority as well to make sure that they're set. So I added a presence validation on the due date and priority. I have the presence and also numericality. So I'm making sure that the priority is a number. I'm making sure it's only an integer. So it has to be a whole number, greater than 0 and less than 6. So that gives us priorities 1 through 5. So after saving that task model, then we do this, and now we could see all the different errors that we have. So we can have a title, and this will be finish validations. And we have a due date, so it's set, and we try to do that. And now we got the priority can't be blank, but what if I do a -4 in there? It says priority must be greater than 0. If I put 7, it has to be less than 6, so we can do a priority of 4. Next, let's create a home page because right now, if we go to the root path, we'll still see the Ruby on Rails. So we'll just go bin Rails G. And for this, we'll do a controller and we'll call this the sites controller. Could call it the welcome controller, the home controller. It's just a controller that's basically all of our static pages. And we'll just have an index action on that sites controller. So when we create that, we can see that we got the new sites controller. We got a new folder for the views for sites, and it also created an index action. Let's look at the sites controller. It just has this one method here. We're not doing anything. We're not interacting with the database. We're not getting data out. It's just a controller, but it does choose the view. By default, it chooses the index view. So when we go down here, we can edit this index view. And now what we need to do is we need to go to our routes file. And again, that's in the config folder, and we'll open up the routes file. You can see the generator kind of already created something there, but we don't want that. But down here, we can define our route path. So our route path will go to, the sites controller and the index action. So then if we take off everything after the path, and again, if you don't have the domain name, this will be localhost:3000. We have a welcome to our to-do list. Now let's just add some navigation. And I just added a nav tag. This is my application.html file in the views layout folder here. This will show up on every page. So we'll create a link to the route path, could go back to the home, and a link to tasks, which will go to the task index path where we'll see all of our tasks. Refreshing, here we have our navigation. So we have the home, and now we have our tasks path. So to finish up, let's do a little bit of styling with CSS, and we're going to learn a little bit about Sass. First of all, in our partial, this is in our app views tasks task partial right here, we can notice that it adds an ID here, and I'll show you that ID in a little bit, but we can also add a class. And I'll refresh, and we'll show our page source. And now we could see that every task has a class task on there, and now we can use the task to select these div tags and add different properties on it. Our style sheets live in our app assets folder, and assets are where we can put our images and our style sheets and other static things that don't need to go through our Ruby on Rails server. And you can see that we have this application.css and then also an application.scss. This is so that we can use Sass. Now this is the file that we want to edit, but I recommend creating a separate file for each model that we have or each controller. So this was the tasks.scss. And now in here, to make sure that we import it, we do @use and tasks, and then a semicolon at the end. And you can see when I saved it that since I'm running the bin/dev command, that my CSS is automatically recompiled into our application.scss. And now with this task here, we can do the .task. And we can do a border, thin, solid, and black. And we might as well do these other things that it suggests. And now let's see what happened. Refreshing, now we got our border. Now let's say that I want to change the size or the font size of the text inside of here. Now, if you know CSS, if I just select paragraph tags, this will change every paragraph on my site. I don't want to do that. So I want to scope it and just the paragraphs inside of the tasks. However, we're using Sass, so this is actually even easier, so we don't have to do this. What we can do is we can put the paragraph selector inside of these brackets here, and then we can set the font size. Now, instead of having to do the .task paragraph to be able to scope this to just paragraphs inside of the task, we can just put this inside, and then our Sass compiler will go ahead and generate the right CSS for us. So when I save this, you can see it's compiled again. And when I refresh, you can see I get larger font size. So that's what I'll leave you with this video. I encourage you to try out doing some more styling and learn more about Sass.